Business.
Travel, business travel. Since COVID, it's actually something that has declined pretty dramatically. But there are times when it makes sense to do. There are times when it makes sense for people to meet face to face. Till we're fully immersed in the metaverse, I think we are going to continue to find it useful to gather people together. If you have a team of people that are working on a similar feature or doing similar work, then gathering that group together can help for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, it helps everyone fully cement in their mind that these other people are people. Instead of it just being Bill, that line on Slack that never answers their questions properly, it's an actual human being who they saw in person and interact face to face. And we react to a human interaction differently than we do to a Zoom call or a Discord message or a Slack message or an email. If we are working on a similar feature, but we do different tasks, this can be especially important for that humanizing of the other peoples of the team, because there can be a tendency for the artists to have a difficult time relating to the programmers and the programmers to the writers. So gathering people that work on a similar feature together to talk about that feature, to interact in some way, can really help that go more smoothly going forward. Even after you're now spread out to the four corners of the earth and you're back to interacting through digital means. Gathering people who do the same work together can offer different benefits because it's an opportunity for brainstorming, it's an opportunity for people to learn things from each other. It doesn't have to be very long, but again, it makes everyone seem human to everyone else, and it potentially gives you an opportunity to tackle some of your gnarlier problems. If you really need to lock down your art direction, gathering a group of your artists together to flesh that out over a couple of days might be worth doing. It can be worthwhile to meet in person, to do travel when you are trying to really lock down commitments. It's easier to trust someone, it's easier to give that trust in a face-to-face interaction. There's just a more personal connection that's occurring in that time. I've worked with studios who gathered everyone together in one giant socializing event once a year. I think there is maybe a benefit to that, but once you cross a certain threshold, you're getting into more forced socialization. I talked about this quite a long time ago about executive retreats. When you cross from the people you're gathering together are people who would normally be interacting with in the day-to-day execution of your job, and crossing into we're gathering together people and forcing an interaction, I question whether or not you're getting nearly so much benefit. Because what's starting to happen then is you're having to force the interaction. You're going to have artificial socialization. It's always going to be a certain degree of awkwardness. And in that case, the different personalities are going to benefit to greater or lesser degrees. The extroverts are going to dominate the situation. They're going to get a lot more out of it. There's going to be a lot of connections made. The introverts are going to be uncomfortable for the entire period of time. You are going to have that to some degree, no matter what, even in the smaller group settings. But in the smaller settings, the connections are at least partially formed through the nature of the day-to-day jobs. So you're connecting two dots as opposed to just tossing two random people into some sort of team building exercise that you decided to do. For now, business travel remains something that is worth doing in certain situations. I think we have found that a lot of these digital forums work a lot better than we feared, but I do think there are cases where it's still worthwhile. Now, getting into the logistics of the situation, I think that you can cause a certain amount of, let's call it employee classism, based upon what your travel policies actually are. If some people travel business class all the time, some people travel first class, some people travel economy, you've set up a situation where you are sorting your employees based on their level. Maybe that's what you want, but why are you doing that? Like, what is the reasoning for that? An argument you might make is that that executive should travel business class so he's more refreshed on the other side of the plane flight. And that makes sense. But then I would ask, why does that apply to the executive and not to the other employees? I have in the past worked with publishers who had a policy where any flight longer than a certain length of time, everyone flew business class, with the expectation being you needed to be rested on the other side. So if we were flying you out there anyway, then it made no difference what level you were. You could be a junior QA person who is going somewhere to set up a build. Doesn't matter. We're flying you business class. We want you fresh so that you can do your job well on the other side. I really like that as a policy. It's much more consistent. If your executives can't stand flying economy under any situation, why is it okay for them to inflict that upon the other members of the organization? For me, I'm actually fine with economy below about 4 hours. Beyond 4 hours, I feel like maybe it makes sense to just upgrade everyone to business class. Economy is pretty awful these days, so maybe you could even talk me into everyone should just always fly business class, especially since we are traveling less than we have in the past. But that's going to be up to the organization to decide, what are you signaling through your travel policy? Do people submit expenses? How are those expenses managed? Some companies have just blanket per diems where every day you're allowed to spend a certain amount of money, no questions asked, and that money is set based upon the city that you're in. I don't know that I actually think that's a great idea, because what you end up having happen is you have some employees will just eat a lot of free continental breakfast and then spend the $60, $70, $80 of their per diem on whatever they want, because they will try to get the money out of the system some way or other. And so they won't really be eating properly. They're not doing what you want them to do in order to try to extract money out of the situation that you provided them with. I think you're better off with a policy about what is and isn't allowed, but that means you need people to keep receipts and submit expenses after the fact. If you aren't providing people with corporate credit cards, and chances are, unless people are traveling a ton, you probably aren't, then what you're doing is you're asking people to take on a financial burden, at least temporarily, until you can reimburse them. So that's something to take into account. If you have relatively junior people traveling, then they may not be able to take on that financial burden of paying their own way in a city that might be much more expensive than they're used to in order to travel for you. So you might want to think about how you handle that situation if it comes up. This is all really in the nitty-gritty of logistics and corporate policy, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about your policies, thinking about what they signal, thinking about how different policies are potentially dividing your organization up into different groups in a way you might mean to do, but you might not actually mean to do. And so by thinking about them up front, you are at least putting consideration into the policy, as opposed to simply ending up with a bunch of rules that were put in place simply because someone did something that you didn't want them to, or because you copied them from the work handbook of some other corporation. Business travel is here to stay for now, even in industries that aren't doing direct sales. So I think this is something that we will continue to have a conversation about. And historically, it's been most of the money that airlines have made. I don't know if that remains true, but it used to be true. So I think the airlines count on business travel remaining, at least for the time being. Have you ever had the opportunity to travel for business? Did you spend time in the city you went to beyond your corporate obligations? That's something I have a very bad habit of not doing. Typically, when I go somewhere, I'm there for the job and I fly in immediately before I'm needed and fly out immediately after I'm needed and don't spend any time in the city. Maybe it's something that I should change in the future. It's been 5 years since I got on an airplane, so I'm a little bit rusty. What are some of your tips for business travel? What are some things that you really wish were different? Let's talk about that down in the comments. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We have merch. I'm currently wearing the "If You Are Doing Triage and You Should Be Doing Triage" shirt. That will be tagged in the video as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.